All right. Ready to rock? Yep. Welcome back to Pod Save the World. This is Tommy Vietor.
I'm Ben Rhodes.
Ben Rhodes is here in studio. As always, later on, you will hear my conversation with Khaled El-Gindi. We talked about the upcoming Israeli elections, the ongoing protests, weekly really, in Gaza, and frankly just about Palestinian politics. Ben and I have talked a lot about Bibi Netanyahu and Israeli politics, and it was really interesting and important, I think, to hear from a Palestinian perspective. Ben and I are going to talk through Trump's decision to cut off aid to 3 countries in Central America, Turkey, and an interesting election in Slovakia. Then we are going to talk about some big news out of Algeria. How often do you get to say that, Ben?
Yeah.
And 6 months after Jamal Khashoggi's brutal murder in Saudi Arabia, how different are things, or are they not? So let's start with President Trump threatening to cut off $500 million worth of funding to El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, supposedly in retaliation for these governments, quote, arranging caravans. That's not accurate. He also threatened to seal the U.S.-Mexico border, which is just so ludicrous and self-defeating and stupid that it's like hard to believe he'll actually do it. But hey, hope springs eternal for this moron. But the funding for these Northern Triangle countries is intended to reduce violence, unemployment, and poverty, and thus encourage people not to leave the country and try to migrate to the U.S. So it seems like Trump will be making the immigration problem he's seeking to solve worse. So I guess there's 2 pieces to this. Like, first, there's the process, which per usual, I guess the announcement wasn't vetted. It caught everyone in his own administration by surprise. But then there's the substance, which, again, per usual, Trump doesn't understand. So the money we provide doesn't go to these governments. It goes mostly to nonprofit groups to administer programs that I think we helped design.
Yeah.
So, Ben, I know you worked a lot on this. Obama increased funding for these countries. Do you think those programs are effective? And what did you make of Trump's decision here?
Well, it's the most self-defeating thing you could choose to do if you actually want to slow migration. We dramatically increased in the Obama administration funding for Central America in the last 2 or 3 years after we had this significant surge in unaccompanied children coming to the border from Central America in 2014. The basic analysis we made is that if we wanted to stop migration, we had to go to the source. So you have to recall, too, Tommy, that the people coming, a lot of the uptick is people seeking asylum. So it's people who are leaving dire circumstances because of the rampant gun violence and gang violence in Central America, because of the lack of opportunity there. The only way that you can deal with those push factors, the factors that are pushing people to try to come to the United States, is by having a strategy aimed at improving security and governance in Central America. And so we were up to $1 billion by the end of the Obama administration, although we always had trouble getting that out of the Republican Congress, which sounds like a lot of money, but it's a fraction of what a wall would cost, and a much better investment. And frankly, some of that money went to advertising about how dangerous it is for people to try to come to the border, to try to communicate that if you come to the border, you're not necessarily going to get in. So part of this was, frankly, discouraging migration. Part of it, again, was working with the governments of Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, to put in place programs that could deal with these factors that are fueling migration. And we, frankly, had a template for how to do this in Colombia, where a sustained U.S. investment over a period of years dramatically improved the security situation and the economy in Colombia and did lead to a downturn in migration. So, like a lot of things Trump does, if he's actually serious about solving the problem of people wanting to come into the United States, the last thing you would do is cut this funding, just like closing the border with Mexico is not going to do anything other than have huge convulsions and disruptions and billions of dollars in trade and in families and workers coming back and forth across the border.
Yeah. So I saw a stat, I think it was Doctors Without Borders did a study in 2015 where 39% of individuals fleeing from those Northern Triangle countries were fleeing violence.
Yeah.
So again, like no wall will be high enough to convince you not to leave a country where you think your kid's going to get killed. But I want to drill down on your point you made about the funding, right? Because Republicans constantly demagogue foreign assistance and aid, and yet building a wall is seen as perfectly good use of money and something the same individuals who hate foreign aid literally chant for at events. Like, was there ever an aha moment for you during the campaigns or during the White House about how Democrats could better message the value or the ROI for taxpayers for these kinds of programs?
Well, the obvious answer right now, you mentioned the violence, is essentially MS-13, right? Mm-hmm. So, we have this problem where there really is a problem of violent gang members in the United States from MS-13. But the reason those gangs exist is because they're unchecked in Central America. And we can deport gang members back there. They will re-enter their gangs. They will perpetrate acts of violence, which will drive people into caravans to try to cross our border. And the gangs will thrive, and they'll be able to continue to recruit in the United States. So if you really want to deal with the violence of MS-13 in our cities, and you want to deal with the migration, you have to both help those governments root out those gangs so they're not able to recruit here in the United States, and you have to help slow this flood of migration. When we were, in the administration, the aha moment, I guess I would say, stands out the most. Is Ebola, where Americans were understandably terrified at the concept of there even being this single case of Ebola in Texas in the summer of 2014. And what we did, in addition to the emergency efforts of deploying our military to West Africa and facilitating a lot of aid workers, we kind of had to help rebuild the public health infrastructure in Liberia, in West Africa, to help stamp out this epidemic. And what you're talking about is hundreds of millions of funding behind public health. But if that can stop a horrific epidemic disease from getting to the United States and killing lots of people, that's something I think Americans would much rather spend that money.
Yeah.
So to me, Ebola is a classic example where not just the emergency, but the longer-term investments in, say, public health in Africa that seem like charity is actually profoundly in our own self-interest.
Right.
Because if they have public health systems that can deal with epidemic disease, then they're not going to reach our borders. And if you take every security challenge we face, terrorism, the disruptions from climate change, all of this can be better dealt with through smart foreign assistance that is a fraction of what we end up paying on the back end to deal with the effects of terrorism or the effects of climate change or the effects of migration. So it'd be interesting to hear if Democratic candidates running are able to articulate in the 2020 election a case for, frankly, a more cost-effective way of dealing with our national security challenges.
That's a really good point. I hope they do that. So let's turn to Turkey. So interesting development over the weekend. Prime Minister Erdogan's party lost in municipal elections in Ankara, the capital, and in Istanbul, which is the biggest city and his key base of support. They're going to challenge these results, but it would be a challenge. Yeah. There would be a major course correction for Turkey, which has been led by Erdogan's Justice and Development Party for like 2 decades. And over time, he has really consolidated control and frankly freaked people out with his authoritarian tendencies. Interestingly, and maybe related and maybe won't be, on Saturday, a liberal lawyer named Zuzana Kaputova won Slovakia's presidential elections. She'll be Slovakia's first female president and has been called Slovakia's Erin Brockovich, which is pretty badass.
Yeah.
So, I mean, look, you and I are not experts on municipal politics in Turkey or Slovakia, but both of these results bucked the trend of ascendant populist anti-EU candidates winning across Europe. And, for a while, all these nationalist right-wing candidates were seen as a backlash to the financial crisis and to increase immigration. I guess the question is, are we seeing a backlash to the backlash, and the pendulum might swing back in a more democratic direction?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the case. And, we've talked about this, but I think the central challenge of our time at home and around the world is this question of what direction our democracy is going to go. More authoritarian right-wing brand of politics or a more inclusive problem-solving brand of politics. And, Erdogan has steadily consolidated power while aiming to divide the opposition and keep them off balance. For him to see this result, and he was the mayor of Istanbul. He's suffering defeats in places that had long been strongholds for his party, it signals that there's a frustration that is pent up that is now directed at him. Whereas he had harnessed a lot of the grievances that people held in Turkey for many years. Now the grievances are about Erdogan and his corrupt and authoritarian brand of leadership. In Slovakia, Kapitova was able to essentially parry the right and people. There was a populist to her left and right, and she ran as a problem solver. And she said when she won, that it showed that it's possible not to succumb to populism and to tell the truth. Those are her words. And so I think there really is an opportunity out there for there to be a backlash to the backlash. We've now had a number of years for these right-wing populists to see what they can do. In the UK, you see what Brexit has yielded. In the US, you see what Trump has yielded. Across Europe, you're seeing that the right-wing populists are good at blaming other people for problems, but not at solving them. And so if people are organized and if leaders step up, I think what we see in these results is the pendulum is poised to swing back. It's not going to happen on its own, though. People have to get in the arena and be committed to doing it.
Yeah. I mean, she's exciting. What, 45-year-old, young lawyer, totally outside the political system and just
wasn't going to take the bullshit from either side and call them both out and said, look, and I don't mean that in a both sidesy kind of way.
No, you're not Howard Schultz.
I just mean in like that you need campaigns that are about more than blaming somebody, that are about actually putting forward, a program for getting things done.
Yeah. Sticking with Turkey for a second, I saw this morning that NATO announced that they will suspend sales of the F-35 fighter jet to Turkey if Turkey decides to go through with the purchase of a Russian-made S-400 missile defense system. I think we've talked about this previously on the show, but the issue is basically that the S-400 system is a Russian missile defense system. It doesn't work with all the other NATO components, and Turkey's part of NATO. And there's also concern that the Russians could essentially use that system being in Turkey to track the F-35, our most advanced jet, learn how to shoot it down. I mean, who knows how real or not these concerns are out of the Pentagon, but I have no reason to doubt it.
Yeah.
So, Ben, I mean, this tension between Turkey and Erdogan and NATO has been building for a while now, but this seems like it's really coming to a head if we're going to suspend this sale. Are you worried at all about a rupture in the alliance, or should we be?
Yeah, I mean, people have been worried about this for a number of years. Putin and Erdogan aren't necessarily, made for one another. Mm-hmm. You may even remember a few years ago the Turks shot down a Russian plane.
Right, yeah.
But at the same time, what Putin does offer is this kind of authoritarian embrace, the same embrace that Trump has fallen into, where, you can say to Erdogan, look, I won't raise these concerns with you about human rights, and, I'm going to kind of back up your brand of politics. Frankly, whenever you have like a major arms sale between a corrupt leader like Putin and a corrupt leader like Erdogan, you kind of wonder about what's happening under the table.
Yeah, for sure.
And so for a lot of time, there's been this worry that Putin would try to make inroads with Turkey. We've been in this kind of awkward embrace with Turkey where we have a lot that we fault Erdogan about. We disagree with Erdogan about the Kurds who we've supported in northern Syria. But at the same time, we're using Turkey as a base for our counter-ISIL campaign. Mm-hmm. We're using Turkey to help stem the flow of foreign fighters in and out of Syria. So Turkey, we needed them in some ways, even though that made us uncomfortable. What you may be seeing now is as the counter-ISIS campaign winds down and that kind of mutual codependence fades, the Turks need us a little bit less to beat ISIS. We need the Kurds a little bit less. Now you see Erdogan drifting in this direction of Putin using this as a convenient way to create a rupture in the alliance. And, I frankly think that this will depend a bit on the direction of what we were just talking about, which is Turkish politics. Mm-hmm. If we're dealing with like 10 more years of Erdogan, it's hard to see how there's not a growing gap between NATO and Turkey, and a kind of growing affinity between Putin and Erdogan. But that's going to take a long time. As you alluded to, the Turkish military is built to be compatible with NATO, not with Russia. So it's not as simple as you buy one system and suddenly you're like in the Russian orbit. Right. They'd have to kind of rejigger their entire military. So it's not going to happen fast, but it's something to watch.
Yeah. We don't often get to say this, but big news out of Algeria today. So after weeks of protests, President Bouteflika finally resigned. Bouteflika is 82 years old. He has been in charge since 1999, but has barely been seen in public since he had a stroke in 2013. Despite that fact, he had been planning to run for a fifth term, kind of a Woodrow Wilson situation here, until protesters forced his hand. So, Ben, two questions. Why the hell should Americans care about what's happening in Algeria? And two, do you feel like this is a continuation of the Arab Spring protests that ultimately took down leaders in Algeria's neighbors, Tunisia and Libya?
Yeah, I think it's a direct line from the Arab Spring. Bouteflika, not only was he incapacitated, he hasn't even appeared in public. When this announcement was made that he's going to run for another term, it was so cynical that his campaign consisted of people bringing a picture of him someplace.
Yeah.
So it wasn't even like trotting the old guy out and shooting him full of steroids.
Not even trying.
He's not even sitting there holding like the newspaper with like the day on it to prove that he's alive. Like for all we know, this guy's dead.
This is straight up Weekend at
Yeah,
Bernie's.
it's straight up Weekend at Bernie's. They're just putting a picture of the guy up at rallies, and you saw a very kind of grassroots Arab Spring style set of protests emerge, where people are just like, we're just not going to take this. Now, the challenge is that there's an entrenched elite in Algeria that is basically the military and a bunch of corrupt business people who've benefited from the status quo, who don't want to see some rapid transition to democracy. And so they're now recognizing that Bouteflika has to be tossed overboard and the military stepping in. And so you're kind of seeing the Arab Spring play out in hyperspeed. The protest dislodged the leader. The military is not waiting for the democratic election that it doesn't like. They're just stepping in now. Mm-hmm. The question is whether that will be enough to quell these protests. I'm not convinced it will be. And so we'll have to see whether this leads to some constitutional reform in Algeria that can at least make incremental progress. I think Americans should care for a couple reasons. I mean, one, Algeria, northern African country, big country, significant, terrorist threats have emanated from that part of the world. Obviously, migration into Europe, and so we have the traditional security concerns. But I think more broadly, as I was watching this, Tom, it's a reminder that the Arab Spring is not something that is fully reconciled yet. Mm-hmm. These protests that we saw in Algeria, they could come back to Egypt. Sisi, Trump is hosting Sisi in the coming weeks and fully embracing this dictator in Egypt who looks like he's kind of fully in charge of the country again. He's got his hand on the iron, he's got an iron fist that he's using to keep people down. This could explode again in Egypt, until these societies find a way to be more responsive to their people and less corrupt and more democratic. You're going to see this express itself in popular protest. And so I think it's an important reminder that we don't know how this is going to play out. It didn't end at the end of the Obama administration. It didn't end even when the Egyptian military took power. This could keep happening.
Algeria is also home to a terrorist named Mokhtar Belmokhtar, who I remember was one of those guys who was reported dead in like 2013, 2015, 2016. This guy was just always kicking around somewhere. There was just like wild open range for these terrorist groups to hang.
I do think that, and at the same time that we take the threat seriously, the militaries in these places, pretty cynically use the threat of terrorism as a kind of vehicle to present themselves as like indispensable to the West. And at a certain point, we have to realize that the presence of these dictatorial regimes continues to be a source of grievances that the terrorists prey on. So, we have to be careful to realize that we don't necessarily, benefit from a status quo where corrupt militaries are repressing their people.
Yeah, very good point. So speaking of repressing people, it has been about 6 months since Jamal Khashoggi, journalist for the Washington Post, was brutally murdered by the Saudis. David Ignatius, a great columnist at the Washington Post, has a long, very deeply reported piece about how he believes the U.S.-Saudi relationship has been rocked by the incident. So there's a lot of really great reporting in this story. You know, he found that members of the Saudi assassination team had received training in the U.S. There were all these contractors that have ties to U.S. persons and intelligence agencies that were helping out the Saudis. But you know, Ignatius seems to think that the U.S.-Saudi relationship just like will never be the same unless Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, fully comes clean about what happened and what his role was in Khashoggi's murder, because Ignatius believes it will just sort of fundamentally hamper defense and intelligence cooperation. I can't help but read that and think it might be a little bit of wishful thinking. I mean, Trump wants things back to normal. Jared already went and visited MBS in Riyadh. I guess, like, my question is, what do you think the nature of the U.S.-Saudi relationship should be at this point?
It's interesting to read this from Ignatius because, you know, you dealt with him a lot when we were in government, I'm sure, and I like him. He's a smart guy. But he was, you know, the kind of guy who was, like, deeply sourced in the Gulf. Mm-hmm. I probably would have slotted him as kind of a proponent of the U.S.-Saudi relationship. So, you know, he's moved a long way.
Yeah,
obviously,
sure.
in part because of what happened to his colleague.
Right.
I think that, you know, the key point here is stepping back and realizing two things. One is, like, Mohammed bin Salman is not going to change, right? So if you're somehow waiting for him to come clean or waiting for some accounting of this, it's not going to happen. Anybody who would send an assassination team with bone saws to another country to kill a journalist and then incinerate his body is not the kind of guy who's going to have some progressive evolution. And we should just add, it is fucking gross that the Trump administration just continues to roll out the red carpet for this guy. You know, Pompeo's meeting him, Jared. I mean, it's really sickening that knowing what we know about what they did to this journalist and knowing everything that we see about the war in Yemen, further reports recently, Tommy, about like child soldiers being recruited to fight with the Saudi Emirati coalition. You know, all of this suggests that we don't need any more data about Mohammed bin Salman. Right? That leads to my second point, which is that it's time to like fundamentally question, why do our relationships in the Middle East have to be this way? You know, the reason that we had this long-standing partnership with Saudi Arabia, it was largely rooted first in the need for a stable production of oil, and then later for the cause of fighting terrorism. But at the same time, we are much less dependent on oil from Saudi Arabia. I think Democrats have a capacity here to step forward and say, it's time to rethink in general our broad approach to this region. If we are moving in the direction of the Green New Deal and a total transition in our energy economy, and if we're moving beyond this hyper-focus on terrorism and spending trillions of dollars to fight terrorists, we just don't need Saudi Arabia like we used to. Mm-hmm. And so we don't need to try to find a way to get to some comfort zone with Mohammed bin Salman. We can move in a different direction here, where we're much less reliant on this partnership. I don't know what the Trump people... there's not like some massive strategic necessity to have this close partnership with Mohammed bin Salman. It's one of the reasons why we've long suspected there could be some corruption at play here. So for me, it's, you know, it should be incumbent on Democrats running for president to articulate, you know, what it means to care about democracy at home and around the world. This is what brings together everything we've been talking about. If you're for democracy, the democratic reforms that we support here in the United States, to make it easier to vote, to make institutions more democratic, a smart strategy for a 2020 candidate is uniting that theme with their foreign policy and saying, everything I'm doing at home and around the world is about democracy and about standing up to authoritarianism. And that means we don't need this Saudi relationship. We may have some legacy areas where we do certain things together, but this should not count as one of our closer partnerships in the world. It just shouldn't, after what was done to Jamal Khashoggi, after what was done in Yemen, after what, frankly, the Saudi foreign policy has done across the Middle East since Mohammed bin Salman came to power.
Yeah, I mean, then there's also, it's been a very weird story to track, but now the security contractor who has been investigating Jeff Bezos's, intercepted or maybe leaked text messages is back to believing that the Saudis may have collected on him in part to get back at him for investigating the Khashoggi murder. I mean, there's a lot of nefarious things potentially happening here.
Yeah, and I think we should be concerned. People talk a lot about Russian intervention in our democracy, in our election. One of the dogs is not happy. In case people can hear the barking. So I think this story should make people realize that for all the focus on Russian interference in our election and in our democracy and on social media, this problem is not limited to Russia. A country like Saudi Arabia that has basically unlimited money, if they choose that they want to go after an American and denigrate that American, they will do so, and I'm sure they are doing so.
Yeah.
It's kind of chilling to think about how if you've got bottomless pockets, think about what you can do in the world today.
Yeah, and intelligence collection is now a for-profit industry. It's not something that governments alone do, as you know better than
and
anyone.
I've had this Israeli intelligence firm, Black Cube, that was investigating my family, trying to dig up dirt. Same people, same crowd that did that to Harvey Weinstein's accusers. I think there's not enough thought being given to when you're dealing in a world in which certain political actors are willing to cross. I mean, if Mohammed Salman's willing to kill somebody inside of Turkey, he'd certainly be willing to spend a lot of money to cause a lot of problems for Jeff Bezos, to embarrass Jeff Bezos. Jeff Bezos is a powerful man, so he can kind of deal with that. But where do they come after us, Tommy? You saw in the Israeli election this story in the Times the other day about all of these Twitter accounts that were created to denigrate Netanyahu's opponents, right? They're doing that in Israel. There's no reason they couldn't do that, in the United States. So I think we have to broadly be aware of this risk that we could just be in this new normal where foreign governments are aiming to tear down people they don't like in media and business and politics in our country. That's something we're going to have to develop antibodies for, and we just don't have them right now.
No, we do not. We have the opposite. We just destroy each other
Just
online.
welcome them in. Yeah.
You mentioned the Israeli elections. I mean, is there anything you're watching? I've been trying to study up on this, and what I realize is how complicated it is. I mean, I think basically you have so many parties and so many candidates running for legislative seats. They need to reach a very small threshold, like 2.5% of the vote, to get a seat in the Knesset, and then you jockey to get them as part of your coalition. It feels like almost impossible to predict.
Yeah, the problem that has bedeviled those of us who've been concerned about the direction of Israeli politics is that it's not like Netanyahu wins over 50% of the vote. In fact, in 2009, when he was elected prime minister for the first time under Obama, he got less votes than Tzipi Livni, his centrist rival. What Netanyahu's a master at is piecing together a coalition amongst all these different parties that get into the Israeli parliament so that he has the biggest bloc. The way that he does that is he moves further and further to the right. So all these kind of crazy right-wing parties, settler parties, Jewish power parties, they get into parliament with these very small numbers of members, but then Netanyahu makes some deal where he embraces an element of their agenda. He moves farther to the right, and that allows him to stay and cling to power. And so what's happening in this election that's interesting is that all the other non-Netanyahu backing parties are coalescing behind this guy Benny Gantz, who's not like a natural politician. And so you'll have essentially a showdown between all the Netanyahu and far-right parties and everybody else. And it's causing this to be a pretty ugly campaign because, it's about the fundamental future direction of Israel. It's not like Gantz is far to the left, but it's people saying, this has gone too far, and Netanyahu has dragged us too far to the right. We're now contemplating seriously the potential for there to be an annexation of the West Bank, a permanent second-class citizen for Israeli Arabs, and just a further and further movement to the right such that Israel is not really both a democracy and a Jewish state. And Gantz is kind of standing, at the threshold of that and saying, stop, And you sent me the article about, him even raising Netanyahu's role in inciting the Rabin assassination, which has long been something that people people on the left in Israel have felt didn't get enough scrutiny because Netanyahu was attacking Rabin, politically, obviously, before that took place. I think that gets at how fundamental the questions are in this election for Israel right now, and people feel like this is about what is the fundamental nature of this country going to be, and so you see this very emotional campaign being waged.
Yeah, I mean, this thing is getting ugly. As you mentioned, I mean, Benny Gantz saying that Netanyahu's language essentially incited the assassin who killed a former prime minister. That's a tough blow.
And a national hero.
In the waning days. Yeah, absolutely. Although I was listening to a podcast with, I think it was Marty Indyk, who is saying that, he's concerned that no matter who wins, there's just zero appetite or interest in a peace process. Literally no one's talking about it. Jared Kushner's plan is dead on arrival either way. Full stop. Yeah, and, part of the thing about the Rabin assassination is that there wasn't a lot of, the degree of self-examination about the right wing in Israel. I mean, here you have this hero, Yitzhak Rabin, a hero in the Israeli military and in politics, and then the man who reached out to make peace with the Palestinians and the Oslo Accords, killed by a right-wing assassin. There was this question of the degree to which that caused some introspection on the Israeli right, and I think that whether you think Gantz went too far or not, he's speaking to this view that there wasn't enough soul searching on the Israeli right about, did we try to stem this rising tide of right wing blowback to the peace process, or did we not do that because it was uncomfortable? And like the idea that there's going to be any near-term movement on the Palestinian issue, though, Israel has to. It's like a lot of other places, like we talked about. Like they have to get their own house in order here for there to be any possibility of peace. Yeah. Last and most important news: The World as It Is going on sale in paperback form.
Yes,
that's exciting.
All you worldos who may not have yet read The World as It Is, my book that came out last spring, can now get this in paperback.
That's huge.
So you can get it under $20. You can break the spine. You can beach reading if you're someplace warm.
You can virtue signal on the subway.
You can virtue signal on the subway. Self-identify as a worldo. So this is on sale today, April 2nd, in paperback.
Nice.
Nice handsome edition. I want to also add that I will be going on a college tour, maybe not quite the same scale as the Pod Save America tour, but I will be, just to give you the dates, and there'll be more, but April 16th at Pomona College here in the LA area, then April 18th at Occidental.
Obama.
Yes.
Sort of alumni.
Our former kind of alumni as well. Then I will be at Princeton, where I never could have gotten in, on April 23rd. Then I will be in D.C. At both American University and Georgetown University, doing a double header.
That's great. What do you do? Do you do Q&A, or is it a speech? Or?
Yeah, I give a talk, and then I'm interviewed by somebody. I do a Q&A. I always stay to sign books. I really like meeting friends of the pod. People turn up in merch. I answer your questions. I do a bit of a mini version of Worldos Want to Know in the signing line. And I'll further have events at UCLA and at the University of Chicago. So, I'll be out there this spring.
You're owning the California market. Look.
Yeah, I'm saturating. It's a big city, though.
The World as It Is, look, this show can get wonky. The World as It Is not a wonky book. It's a bunch of great stories about foreign policy and Barack Obama and what it's like to be in government, but also what it's like to grow up under the most intense scrutiny you could possibly manage and come out on the other side a human being, even if it takes us all some time to find ourselves again. So I highly recommend it.
Well, thanks. And it really is. I was 29 when I went to work for Obama in 2007, and it's kind of a coming of age story about what's it like to to enter into that experience and be spit out the other end when you're 39 and, having gone through a decade of that.
You're like, what happened?
Yeah, what happened? I mean, how old were you at the beginning of the Obama campaign yet?
2007, I was 27. I started working for him when I was 23 or 24.
Yeah. So it's funny because we got to get to know each other in that primary when you're in Iowa. And I can't help but think about those days now as I see these campaigns gearing up.
Oh, it's the best.
But, I was writing all the, Iraq was central to our campaign.
It's weird that there's no one central foreign policy issue
Yeah.
that's at the heart of this campaign.
Because I remember getting on the phone with you, like, right away, because you're answering all these questions. I remember the first thing I had to do, and I tell this story in the book, I wrote this speech where we said we're going to Pakistan to get bin Laden.
Oh, yeah.
And... unfortunately, because of the way it came out, it sounded like we were going to invade Pakistan, which kind of cut against our anti-war credentials. And I kept saying like, no, we're talking about actually what happened, like a special operation or something. But this became a huge problem in Iowa, where all our lefty friends are suddenly saying, "Wait, I thought you got against the Iraq War." So I get to work and I describe. I thought I was going to be fired like the first day I got there because I wake up and there's mass protests in Pakistan. And Pervez Musharraf, the president of Pakistan at the time, was blaming Obama. And we'd caused this international incident. And I'm sleeping on a friend's couch at 4 in the morning. I get an email from Dan Pfeiffer because he oddly always woke up at like 4 in the morning.
So early.
And I'm on the email chain with Axelrod and Pluff and Dan and everybody, and you were probably on that. And he's like, "This is the worst thing that's happened to us yet." and I'm like, "I'm the new guy who caused this." So I thought I was getting fired. Instead, I get to work. And Favreau was there, and he's like, "Hey, man, like, how's it? Good to see you." And I was like, "Oh, I wasn't expecting a warm welcome." And he's like, "Yeah, Pluff wants you to write an op-ed to kind of put this Pakistan thing to bed." And I was like, "Okay, Washington Post, here I come." And he said, No, it's for the Mason City Globe Gazette.
Damn right it was.
So that must have been your handiwork there, placing the op-ed in the Mason City Globe Gazette.
Look, that's worth its weight in gold.
Some of my finest work.
Yeah.
A reminder, by the way, that for all these national polls, I think we were probably down 30 points in the national polls at the time. Don't pay any attention to them.
Totally relevant.
Totally relevant because one of these people you see in the single digits in the national polls could win Iowa, and then everything changes.
I mean, for God's sake, no one knew who Mayor Pete was 3 months ago. Now it's like everybody's talking about him. So
and the thing
take a deep breath.
Well, and the thing you taught me, Tommy, is that I'd be stressing about our press coverage in the New York Times and the Post, and you'd be like, "You're not reading the press coverage in the Mason City Globe Gazette and the Des Moines Register," which was much better.
That's the good shit.
Yeah, that's the good shit. That's the crack right there.
Buy the world as it is. It's a bunch of great stories. And after the break, I'll be back with my conversation with Khalid El-Gindi.